Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Theological Leftovers. This coming Sunday, we are looking at Luke chapter 10, verses 23 through 37. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's going to be the focus of our sermon, I believe. I haven't written yet, but that'll be the focus of the sermon this coming Sunday, the 13th Sunday after Trinity. This is in the one-year series. Some of that makes no sense to some of you, but for those of you who may be from a sister congregation, we use a 3-year series. It may be confusing if I don't mention it, so that's why I'm mentioning it. But anyway, Gospel is from Luke chapter 10, Parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm going to focus on that on Sunday, which means I'm not going to be able to focus that much anyway on the Old Testament reading. So today's Theological Leftover focuses on 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 8 through 15. And I'm going to read it to you. You may want to look it up so you can follow along. This is a story that you may not be that familiar with. 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 8 through 15. And it is a wonderful pairing to put this with the gospel reading and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you'll see why as I read it to you. From 2 Chronicles 28. The men of Israel took captive 200,000 of their relatives, women, sons, and daughters. They also took much spoil from them and brought the spoil to Samaria. But a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded. And he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria. And he said to them, I just want to stop there for a moment. This is an amazing scene, an absolutely amazing scene. First of all, notice that a battle has taken place. And that battle is sort of like our civil war, right? It's between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. These are brothers, and they are fighting. And the men of Israel, the northern kingdom, won. And they took captive 200,000 of their relatives. And with that, they brought spoils to Samaria. That's the northern kingdom's capital city. So they conquered, they defeated, they took captives, and they took the spoils of the battle. They took from Judah some of their wealth, right? And so here they come with their captives, with the spoils of war, feeling pretty good about themselves. The whole army is coming up to Samaria. And what happens? In verse 9, but a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded, and he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria. So an entire army, one man, right? Isn't that amazing? Isn't that awesome? Talk about courage. One man. And he comes to them and he says to them, behold, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. And now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female, as your slaves. Have you not sins of your own against the Lord your God? Now hear me, and send back the captives from your relatives whom you have taken, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. He's speaking the word of the Lord with great boldness and courage. What you're doing is wrong, right? You have your own sins. They're being punished for their sins, but their sin, do not allow their sin to beget more sin in your life. Don't do the wrong thing just because they did the wrong thing, right? This is such a great lesson for us, isn't it? How often does somebody else's sin beget sin in our life? Because somebody did something wrong to us, we think that excuses us to participate in wrong behavior. It is not so. Sin should not beget sin. The sin of others should not beget sin in my life. It doesn't give me the excuse, right? Great lesson there. So he shared this message with them of what they should and shouldn't do. What happens? Continuing with verse 12. Certain chiefs, so this isn't universal, this isn't everybody, right? This isn't the whole army, but certain chiefs also of the men of Ephraim, Azariah, the son of Johanan, Berechiah, the son of Meshillamoth, Jehizekiah, the son of Shallum, and Amasa, the son of Hadlai. So some very specific people in that group. They stood up against those who were coming from the war. Right? So now the prophet isn't standing alone. It only mentions certain chiefs. It mentions 3 people. Please, wait, let me make sure. 1, 2, 4 people, right, who heard what the prophet said, and now the prophet doesn't stand alone. These 4 chiefs among the people stood up against this oncoming group of soldiers victorious from war, and they add their words to the words of the prophet. They say to the army, "You shall not bring the captives in here. For you purpose to bring upon us guilt against the Lord in addition to your present sins and guilt. For our guilt is already great, and there's fierce wrath against Israel." So they said, "You're not bringing them here. No way. You are not going to add to our sin and to our guilt. We won't participate," right? That's what they say. So how does the army respond? They've heard the prophet. They've heard 4 of their chiefs. How do they respond? It says, "So the armed men left the captives and the spoil before the princes and all the assembly." Right? So they left everything right there. Apparently they went on their way. Right? So they kind of listened. They didn't take everybody back. They just kind of left everybody there. And they went away. And what happens next? It says, "The men who have been mentioned by name, they rose and they took the captives, and with the spoil they clothed all who were naked among them. They clothed them, gave them sandals, provided them with food and drink, and anointed them." In other words, provided medical care for them and cleaned them up. It says, "And carrying all the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kinsfolk at Jericho, the city of palm trees, and then they returned to Samaria." I absolutely love this story, and you can see why it's paired with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The way the Good Samaritan takes care of the person from Judah is the same way these people who were in Samaria took care of the people who had come from Jerusalem and from Judah. So you have a real example of exactly what Jesus was talking about in his parable about loving our neighbor and what it means to love our neighbor. So there's a real life example from 2 Chronicles, and I love the way that pairs up. But I especially wanted to share this today because we've been talking a little bit, at least in past Bible class, we're on to something new now. We just had a couple of weeks extra, so we talked about principles of leadership. And this is such a great example of Christian leadership, right? Why? Why do I say that? Well, there's a couple things, and I just wrote a few notes in the column here. One is they listened to the word of the Lord. Right? The prophets spoke, and these 4 men, they listened. As far as that goes, it's a great example of leadership from the prophet because he heard the word of the Lord. He knew what needed to be said, and that meant rebuking an entire army standing in front of him. So this took courage, but they listened to the word of the Lord, right? Part of listening to the word of the Lord for these chiefs especially was acknowledging their own sin. They could not act self-righteous. They could not act like that this victory was some evidence that God was pleased with them. Right, that they were righteous, right? And sometimes we think that when other people, maybe even people that we consider enemies, when they're overcome, when they're defeated, when they're struggling, we somehow feel self-righteous because of it. These men did not fall into that trap. They acknowledged they listened to God's word, they acknowledged their own sin, and they feared God more than they feared that army. Right? They feared God more than they feared men. And this is a key principle when it comes to being a Christian leader. Listening to God's word, acknowledging our own sin, fearing God more than we fear men. And then finally, they showed compassion. Right? What they were told was, don't take in these spoils of war. Don't take these people as your slaves. And I suppose they could have just left them and said, we're not going to take you. You can go back. But they were defeated in battle, and they were in no position to go back. And so what did the people do? These chiefs, they showed great compassion over and above, just like the Good Samaritan in the parable. They used the spoils of war, but they even used their own resources in order to provide care. And then they personally took them back to their kinsfolk to make sure that they were safely home, right? This is above and beyond, right? I mean, these are military leaders, and they just went to battle against Jerusalem, and this is the compassion they showed to their enemies, who were actually their brothers, right? A lot to consider here for you as you think about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Christian leader, how we as Christians can love our neighbor. We hear love and we think about feelings, right? We think about good feelings. Don't make the mistake of thinking there were good feelings that these chiefs had towards these people. They had gone to battle. These people had all kinds of differences, right? There's no reason to think that they liked each other, and yet they loved their neighbor. Right? They loved their neighbor by listening to God's word. It had nothing to do with how they felt about the people. They listened to God's word. They acknowledged their own sin. They feared God more than men. And they showed compassion. Right? That's what it means to love. What a great definition of love. And what a great example of leadership. I hope you'll consider these things, pray about these things, and take them to heart. And I hope that I have the opportunity to see you here at Concordia on Sunday. God bless your week.